What do you do when everyone turns against you? Now, thankfully, it's never really true that everyone turns against us. But it sometimes feels that way when enough people are against us, or the right kind of people, the loud people, the influential people are against us, or those who are close to us are against us. When that happens, it can feel like everyone's against us, like the whole world is opposing us. Well, that's how David felt in Psalm 56, our Psalm of the week. David is again running from Saul, as the superscription tells us. It refers us back to 1 Samuel chapter 21 and the events that take place in David's flight from Saul. The 1 Samuel tells us that David had recently acquired the sword of Goliath from Ahimelech, the priest of God, which David had used earlier to cut off Goliath's head in his victory over the Philistines. Now, for some reason, probably out of total desperation, David thinks it wise to take Goliath's sword into Goliath's hometown of Gath to seek refuge. Well, perhaps not surprisingly, the people of Gath recognize that this is David, the one about whom people had sung, Saul killed his thousands, David killed his tens of thousands. And it was Philistines that they had killed, that David had killed. And so David's thinking perhaps was, well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the Philistines and Saul were certainly enemies, but it doesn't work out that way. And so when David hears this song about him killing the Philistines circulating through the town of Gath, he becomes afraid. He realizes these people will hate me. They will not protect me. They won't shelter me. They're against me too. And so David, we're told in 1 Samuel, pretends to be insane. He forsakes his dignity for the sake of his life. And the king of Gath hears about it. He's appalled by this behavior of this former hero and sends him away. David, at this moment then, is truly and fully alone when it comes to human helpers. He was afraid, verse 3 says. It wasn't until later that people began rallying to David to support him, as 1 Samuel 22 says. People, in David's own words, in Psalm 56, verse 1 and 2, were trampling on him all day long. So, how is it that David was able to trust in the Lord alone, afraid, trampled on? We know he trusted in the Lord because 3 times in Psalm 56, verse 3, verse 4, verse 11, David says, I trust in you, even when I'm afraid. Well, 3 things that David focuses our attention on when we're afraid. And first of all, it's this: God cares about us. When no one else seemed to care, when he was lonely and afraid, David remembered this, as he writes in verse 8, you, speaking to God, you have kept count of my tossings, his tossing and turnings on his bed as he's wondering what's going to happen to me tonight or tomorrow or the next day. You have kept count of my tossings, put my tears in your bottle. Are they not all in your book? No child of God, and David realizes this, and you can too, no child of God has ever shed a tear or experienced the rapid heartbeat of anxiety or the sinking, tightening feeling in your stomach when things seem to be going wrong. No one's ever experienced those kinds of things that God missed. We never, if we're trusting in the Lord, if we are truly his children, we never suffer alone. It may feel that way, but we're never alone. God cares. Second, God actually is for his children. Verse 9, God is for me, David says. What an important understanding, because everybody's against him. Right? Saul is against him. The army of Saul is against him. The king of Gath is against him. Evil people are all day long, he says, injuring my cause. Everybody's against me. But here's what David realized. God always sides with those who have taken refuge in the Messiah. God can never become an enemy of those who have fled for refuge to Jesus Christ. And so God is for his children, never against us. No matter who else is, God is never against us, always for us. And then third, God will not allow evil to disrupt his good plan for us. Paul picks up on this in Romans 8. He says, if God is for us, which is what David had said in Psalm 56, verse 9, God is for me. Paul says, if God is for us, who can be against us? Who can be against us? David had put it this way in verse 11 and verse 4. If God is for me, what can man do to me? What can the flesh do to me? And the answer is nothing that's outside of God's good plan for me. The things that happen to us, that people do to us, don't feel right. They aren't right in many cases. But they never are able to violate God's ultimate saving and sanctifying plan for his people. God cares, God is for his children, and the evil that people do to us never disrupts God's good plan for us. Now, the hard part of this lesson is that it's often learned in a place of great difficulty, as David experienced here. It often takes moments of total abandonment, or feelings at least of total abandonment, to realize that God is more dedicated to his children than our enemies are in opposing us. Let's take this in as we read Psalm 56, beginning with the introduction, which throws us back to the circumstances of David in 1 Samuel. To the choir master, according to the dove on far-off terebinth, a miktam of David, when the Philistines seized him in Gath. Be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me. All day long an attacker oppresses me. My enemies trample on me all day long. For many attack me proudly. When I'm afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust. I shall never be afraid. What can flesh do to me? All day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They stir up strife. They lurk. They watch my steps as they have waited for my life. For their crime will they escape? In wrath, cast down the peoples, O God. You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not all in your book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. In God, whose word I praise, in the Lord, whose word I praise, in God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? I must perform my vows to you, O God. I will render thanks offerings to you, for you have delivered my soul from death, yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life.